And now, stand-up community subscribers and listeners from around the globe, it's time to Stand Up with Pete Dominic, where we ask the important questions that impact you, your family, and your community. Such as, could generic carbonated drinks finally help me cure my addiction to Fresca? And with social media platforms criticized for improper content regulation, where is the best place online where I won't look and sound like a complete doofus? And now, the podcast host who never appears foolish online, at least according to the experts, Pete Dominic!
Yes, Pico. Now, to be fair, the experts are all in my pocket, or else I would probably appear like a complete jackass on a regular basis, whether it be on social media or here on this podcast. Thanks, critics. I will send you your check soon. And thank you, Pico, for another great intro. Hello, my friends. How are you? How's it going? I just had the virtual search for the superintendent, and I was arguing with the local folks in my town about what the important qualities are, and it was animated and divisive, and I'm glad I showed up. You got to show up for such things. If you're not working to elect local leaders, then I highly recommend that you get involved. Okay, folks, I've got a great show for you. Barry Ritholtz joins me today, always a great, and the most popular progressive radio host and author, Thom Hartmann, joining me as well to talk about his new book, The Hidden History of Big Brother in America. Ritholtz and Hartmann on today's episode of Stand Up, and I am very glad that I have you. Can't do it without you. Sign up to be a paid subscriber right now and join us at the Hangouts on Thursday nights. Go to standupwithpete.com. I use the Patreon subscription service. You can also go to patreon.com/Pete Dominic. Sign up now and you'll get an email every day from me with a beautiful picture of vitamin N sent in from another subscriber like you. All right, there's a reason why this is the best daily news podcast that you can find in all of podcast world, because nobody does as much of a comprehensive update and recap from the last 24 hours of news as I do right here in all the world of podcasting. How do I know? I don't know. I just say that. It's just one of those things that I say, not knowing if it's any, that's completely subjective anyway. All right, I got a news update. I got two guests almost every day. So let's get to it. Time for the last 24. All right, let's start as I have been starting since late February with headlines coming out of Putin's invasion into Ukraine. The New York Times headline is, to show support, 3 European leaders visit Kiev in flames. Leaders of the Czech Republic, Poland, and Slovenia went to Kyiv to show unequivocal support for Ukraine as fighting raged around the capital. Here's CNN's Brianna Keeler with that headline yesterday morning.
Breaking just moments ago, word that the prime ministers from Poland, the Czech Republic, and Slovenia are traveling to Kyiv today to meet with President Zelensky, which, of course, is remarkable. This is a remarkable statement of solidarity under great personal risk that you would be hard-pressed to find an example of in history. It's akin to world leaders going to London during the Blitz.
Well, that is some historical comparison, Brianna Keeler. What else do I have for you? Headlines about Ukraine. CNN says Zelensky's appeals for help to end Russia's invasion. And President Zelensky addressed the Canadian Parliament yesterday. Today, he's going to be addressing the American Congress. But here he is yesterday. He was addressing the Canadian Parliament. Let me set it up for you. And the prime minister there, Trudeau, two handsome leaders right there, Zelensky and your Trudeau. I don't know which one I rather have sex with and which one I want to marry. You know what I'm saying? Huh? Sorry. Well, either way, here he is. Zelensky had just addressed Canadian Parliament, and he has given a standing ovation after Trudeau's remarks.
Volodymyr, in the years I've known you, I've always thought of you as a champion for democracy. And now democracies around the world are lucky to have you as our champion.
All right, there it was, and then they all stood up, and we'll see if he gets a similar reaction in the American Congress when he addresses them later today, if you're listening on Wednesday the 16th. I mean, Congressman, what's her name, Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene, were they going to heckle him while he's addressing Congress, rooting for Putin? I don't know where they are on this. Russian POWs voiced disquiet and shame over war in Ukraine. New satellite image shows the destruction of Russia's equipment at Kherson Airport. More than 3 million Ukrainians have fled. Talks between Russian and Ukrainian negotiators are set to resume today, according to Ukraine's negotiator. China being warned not to assist Vladimir Putin. Here is the State Department spokesman Ned Price talking about the People's Republic of China, or as the cool kids say it, the PRC.
Now, of course, the PRC has been an outlier in this. We have made very clear to the PRC that we will not allow any country, whether that is the PRC, whether that's any country around the world, to attempt to compensate Moscow for the losses it is suffering, whether that's in the form of economic assistance, financial assistance, or material support to its war effort in Ukraine. We have been very clear with the PRC yesterday. As you know, our national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, and a delegation that included senior State Department officials, they were in Rome yesterday, where they met with Young Jachur, essentially the national security advisor in the PRC. This was another opportunity for us to lay out very clearly our concerns and the implications, as we're going to be watching very closely for any form of support that the PRC may seek to pass to the Russian Federation.
All right, there he goes, talking about China and Russia, and that seems to be one of the most important conversations and key points here. Now, here is the Wolf Blitzer, CNN. He caught up with the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. You ever think about how many secretaries of state Wolf Blitzer's interviewed? The answer is 4,000. All of them. I don't think we've had that many. There it is.
As the risk of miscalculation, though, grows, the UN Secretary General says the prospect of nuclear conflict is now, and I'm quoting him now, within the realm of possibility. How real is the risk of this spiraling into nuclear war?
Well, President Biden's been very clear that one thing is for sure is that we're going to avoid getting into any kind of conflict with Russia, and certainly avoiding anything that brings us to World War III. Some of Russia's loose talk about its nuclear weapons is the height of irresponsibility and goes against everything that we've said, including that Russia's said over many years about how a nuclear war is not winnable, something that was reaffirmed as recently as the meeting between President Biden and Putin back in this summer in Geneva. So we watch this very, very, very carefully. There's a lot of bad loose talk and bluster. At the same time, I have to tell you, we have real concerns that Russia could use a chemical weapon, another weapon of mass destruction. This is something we're very focused on. Unfortunately, we've seen them use or acquiesce to its use before in Syria, with Syria using these weapons, using them itself, trying to assassinate its opponents, including in the United Kingdom. So this is something we are very focused on. Well, if they do use chemical weapons, what will the U.S. and the NATO allies do? We've been very clear, including with Russia, with others, that there would be a very serious response, not just from us, but from the international community. I'm not going to spell it out here, but the consequences would be severe.
All right. Well, what are they going to do? Cyber attack? They're going to shut the lights off? What do you mean? Give me some ideas. What are some of the retaliation tactics that could be taken by the U.S. and our Western allies? What do you think, folks? Okay. Well, now I want to go over to Democracy Now!, who had journalist from the New Yorker who is an expert on Putin and Russia. He's written a lot about it. Here he is on the issue of the no-fly zone and what that would mean.
In talking about what a no-fly zone would entail, I think it's important we remember the military details of what we're talking about here. A no-fly zone is not a kind of magical spell you cast over the skies of Ukraine so planes can't fly. It is the commitment to use military force to shoot down those planes. It is an act of war, essentially. And I think that it's therefore understandable why the Biden administration is wary, if not refusing, to commit itself to essentially enter the war. That is what installing a no-fly zone would mean, or at least that is what implementing a no-fly zone would entail. It would entail American military strikes against Russian military targets. That is effectively the United States entering the war. And I think that there are understandable reasons. First and foremost, as you mentioned, the desire to avoid a nuclear exchange. So what might be possible? Some people are talking about other sorts of technical means. Could there be a technical solution to scramble or make difficult the flying of airplanes over Ukrainian airspace using cyber or technical means? That's one possibility. Another is the supply of anti-aircraft weapons to Ukraine. So it would be Ukrainians using this equipment to bring down Russian aircraft. I think that would still be really controversial for Russia, but not as nearly as much as America doing it itself.
Well, I thought that was great analysis from Joshua Yaffa, the New Yorker, on Democracy Now! And let's head to cyber war expert, Russian expert, my friend Clint Watts. He was on MSNBC yesterday, where he said disinformation from Russia is like Mad Libs. The narrative stays the same. The arc is the same. They just substitute out the country and the people and the current circumstances with a little kernel of truth, and they run with it.
Tell me, sort of as a student of this disinformation, what happens next?
Yeah, so what's interesting, Nicole, is disinformation from Russia is like Mad Libs. The narrative stays the same. The arc is the same. They just substitute out the country and the people and the current circumstances with a little kernel of truth somewhere else, a screenshot from a website, something like that, and then they run it. And that also is a base layer of propaganda that should they want to do something, they're telling on themselves, right? They're saying, hey, there's a chemical weapons somewhere out there. Well, we've seen this playbook before. Later, chemical weapons are used. I think where it comes in militarily that we should be concerned is they lay this propaganda down. If you went onto the internet and looked up chemical weapons attack, the first thing that shows up is what they've been saying, right? Because they've started the narrative. But separately now, they've bypassed population centers in the east of Ukraine. They're meeting stiff resistance from Ukrainian military around Kharkiv. Well, how do you clear a population center without destroying every single building? That's a chemical weapons attack. And so there's an impetus and a motive to do it. They're already speaking about it. So I think we have to really take into consideration that it may not be today, but 2-3 weeks down the road, the Russian military is in extreme bind. They've got resistance in their rear. They can't supply logistics. And what do they need to do? They need to get rid of that. And a way to do that is chemical weapons. And if you look at the claims that they're making in their disinformation about chemical weapons labs or places there, almost all of them are in the eastern part of Ukraine.
All right. Now, I've given you a bunch of smart analysis, I think, from several different guests here. And now it's time to give you some dumb analysis. I mean, they are really dumb over at Fox News. They are more appealing to the part of your brain which gets fired up and reacts over conflict and drama and fear. Whatever part of your brain is that? What is that? The cerebellum? The antebellum? I don't know much about the brain. The medulla? I don't understand. Anyway, that's what they do. They don't have thoughtful conversations. They're not deep conversations. They don't have the type of policy experts and government experts that I think most other, quote, news networks have. And it's evidence from their morning lineup. And they got the Ducey, Steve Ducey, and then Kilmeade, who's dumb as a box of stones. And then they have these alternative. They always have a woman. So they have two guys, and those usually them. Sometimes it's Will Smith. Will Cain. I wish Will Smith was there, but they don't have him. My old friend Will Cain, who has completely jumped the shark. Sometimes they got that guy, that Pete Hegseth, who's got the most punchable face in the world. Anyway, this is Rachel Campos Duffy, and she made her name on The Real World on MTV. And now she fashions herself a foreign policy expert. And the only place where Brian Kilmeade could ever sound smart is sitting next to her. And I hate how sexist it sounds. I get it. But this is real dumb stuff, and I thought I'd share it with you.
Monroe Doctrine, and I think we would be very concerned about this kind of action in our hemisphere. I think he said, keep it neutral. And in the end, probably Ukraine is going to lose more land because of this. Again, the main problem here, as you see, and as we discussed, the main problem is still China. And now we've created a bigger bloc, China and Russia together. This is why our policymakers aren't thinking long term. Right. Provoking this war has brought our two enemies closer together.
They provoked the war.
Well, they had a red line. and we had an agreement in November with a security agreement.
They can't make a red line on other countries, Rachel. It's not up to them to make a red line on other countries.
This is the fate of the geography of Ukraine, and they could have remained a free country. We could have armed them. We could have actually...
No, you understand. Russia got their way. They lost their stooge in an election. The minute they lost their stooge in an election, it had nothing to do with us. They took Crimea and the 2 Donbass regions, and they said, we're going to do more unless you put our guy back. We go, not only are we not going to put your guy back, we're going to have more elections, and then Zelensky beats Poroshenko, and now he established himself with 70% of the vote. Why should a democracy give up because Vladimir Putin's a lunatic?
Well, what is happening on the ground...
I mean, listen, I got to say that analysis by Brian Kilmeade is as good as anybody else's, if not better. He's dead on right about the election and the rest of it. That was great analysis by Kilmeade. Hey, when you're right, you're right. And he was right and she was wrong, embarrassingly wrong. And it's hard to understand why you could get that so wrong, but she's got to blame like the Asian country in that case. There is no doubt that the primary aggressor is Vladimir Putin, but she just didn't want to have it. She's like, nah, the main problem is China. And that's what I heard. I'm just telling you, I heard a little bit of racism. Maybe you didn't hear that. That's what I heard. I heard a little bit of racism there, eh? No, a little taste for Rachel Campbell's Duffy. Okay. Well, now speaking of racism, here is Eric Trump, the recount on Twitter that my friend Slade Selmer runs it. They made a funny mashup of Eric Trump. He was on Sean Hannity and he said my father like a billion times, and they just edited him saying my father. And so here's that edit by the recount, which I think is funny.
And my father was, what did my father say? That my father sent a lot of javelin missiles. Listen, my father's always had great intuition. Under my father was.
Your father said.
Oh, he's such a whiny little, you know what? Eric Trump stinks. All right, yesterday was Equal Pay Day. Did you know that? It's Women's History Month, International Women's History Month, and Women's History Day, but it's also it's Equal Pay Day in America. The date symbolizes how far into the year women must work to earn what women earned in the previous year. And over at the White House, they took it pretty seriously. They announced critical steps, the Biden-Harris administration yesterday, at a big press conference, big announcement, to take pay equity and promote women's economic security. The president, the vice president, the speaker of the House. Let's first listen to Kamala Harris yesterday on Equal Pay Day. How about that?
So I'll begin with a simple truth. Our economy just has not been working as it should for the women of our nation. Across industries, women are less likely to be hired than equally qualified men. They are paid less and promoted slower for doing similar work. Women are routinely shut out of good jobs in high-paying industries, such as science and technology, construction and truck driving, in part because our society tells women that some industries are just not for them. And as study after study has shown, women are expected to shoulder an unequal share of unpaid caregiving responsibilities. When families cannot afford or cannot find caregiving, such as childcare, elder care, or home care, it often falls on women to fill the gaps, whether that means going part-time or leaving the workforce entirely, or working full-time at a paid job and full-time performing unpaid caregiving.
All right, that's Kamala Harris on Equal Pay Day yesterday. We also, of course, heard from the principal, the president, Joe Biden.
Earlier today, I signed an executive order to promote efforts to achieve pay equality, pay equity for employees of federal contractors. And it's my hope that this sets an example for all private companies to follow as well. That's the purpose of what I did. Let me just close with this. Gender equality is not a women's issue alone. It benefits everybody. That's a fact. It benefits everyone. Our society, our economy, and our country.
Here is Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, the first female Speaker of the House, and she's had that job now twice. Will she be able to keep it is the question. Here is Nancy Pelosi on Equal Pay Day. She was there, too.
There's a decision. I mean, we were talking about survival for some people. We want them to have success as we go forward. But to do that, we have to be transformational in how we recognize the challenge that we face, and pass legislation and establish public policy to make the difference for women. In this Women's History Month, last week, we celebrated Title IX, 50-year anniversary coming up in another month or two, honoring Patsy Mink, who established that. You mentioned Shirley Chisholm, who had so many great things to say about this. And now we have our role to play in all of this. And again, maybe next year, as Congresswoman Lawrence said, maybe next year we will have passed a bill for equal pay for equal work, and this will be a sad remnant of the past.
All right, there you go, Vice President Kamala Harris, President Biden, Speaker of the House on Equal Pay Day. President Joe Biden yesterday also signed a massive spending bill into law, including $13 billion, almost $14 billion in new aid to Ukraine. And here he is at the signing ceremony for the big spending bill yesterday.
So let me close with this. Today, we're again showing the American people that as a country, we can come together as Democrats, Republicans, and Independents and do big things, that our democracy can deliver and outperform autocracies, and that there's nothing we can't do when we do it together as the United States of America. So I'd like to now invite up my budget director, Shalonda Young, and all the members of the Congress here today while we sign this bipartisan
Okay, sorry, Mr. President, I'm going to just cut in here because this is all right. And then they went and they signed it. But in other news, yesterday, the Georgia Senate candidate, Herschel Walker, former football player and current stupid person, he questioned a theory of evolution on Sunday by pointing to the existence of apes. He has been endorsed by Donald Trump. He appeared at the Sugar Hill Church in Georgia with some other religious nut job. And he donned his amateur theologian hat while speaking with this pastor, Chuck Allen. You got to hear it.
Here, that means somebody up there had to say, let there be light, that the earth started. And then he had to put someone there on earth. Because remember, Adam was there. Remember, Adam came there, then Eve came. So somebody had to start it out. So that means there had to be a God. So it didn't just some bomb blew up and it started out. And then I'll tell you something else I heard. Now think about this. Because at one time, science said man came from apes. Did it not?
That's when you go to the science. Every time I read or hear that, I think to myself, you just didn't read the same Bible I did.
Well, this was interesting, though. If that is true, why are there still apes? Think about it.
Now you're getting too smart for it.
No. Think about this. We have an evolution we've gotten so intelligent that if that is true, why are there still apes? And then the conception of a baby. Let me tell you, science can't do that. They still trying to do it, but they can't because there had to be a God.
Oh, no. Oh, dear. Oh, so bad. Real bad stuff. May surprise both the guys that the great apes are members of the Hominidae family of primates, and the existence of other kinds of apes is actually not a point against evolution. No, actually, if anything, it's indicative of the way that populations of species change over time, sometimes into new species, but it doesn't mean the old species go extinct. They sometimes coexist, which is why we have obviously many different variants of COVID. A poll, by the way, conducted last month shows that Herschel Walker has a huge lead among Republican primary voters. He's yet to win the nomination for the Republican Senate, but 70% of respondents said that Walker is their preferred choice. And the winner of the primary will face Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock in November. But over at The New Yorker, I thought this is interesting. Ed Kilgore, writing at The New Yorker, says about this, I'm beginning to understand why Herschel Walker has limited his speaking appearances. Luckily for him, he needs no real introduction to Georgia voters. But if he hopes to defeat his Democratic opponent, incumbent Raphael Warnock, in November, he should keep in mind that the Reverend Warnock has spoken on religious topics at length every Sunday for many years. Herschel Walker would be smart not to compete on that playing field. I hope Ed Kilgore is right about that. All right, there's a whole bunch more sound out there, but I didn't grab any more for you. This is all I've got, and I hope that it gives you a good perspective on yesterday's news, although there's always so much more. Send it to me. If you're seeing it, if you're watching it, if you're hearing it on a YouTube show, a podcast, a corporate media show, send it over to standupwithpete@gmail.com. And by the way, yesterday I said that, I'm not sure if people prefer, maybe if I have one guest, it's like over an hour like I did yesterday with Dr. Brian Rosenwald, or if I have two guests for 20 or 30 or 40 minutes apiece. And Kim Nyborg up in Iowa said, you make it, I'll listen to it. One interview for an hour, I'll listen. 3 interviews for 3 hours, I'll listen to that too. Just thought you should know. Today was awesome. I love Brian Rosenwald. Thank you, Kim. Thank you very much. Follow her on Twitter at K Von Nyborg. She's so good. So many amazing, smart, beautiful, wonderful, amazing listeners. Thank you very much for your contributions, your compliments, and your criticisms, like the one that came from Matthew K yesterday. Said, I love the show, but I have a bit of a constructive criticism. Hopefully it's constructive and not just me complaining. Maybe don't ask many non-medical doctors about their opinion of medical things like COVID. Most recently, Dr. Brian Rosenwald had a lot of strong opinions about the effects and science of COVID. I'm really sure he's smart, but I bet Dr. Aaron Carroll, who's an actual expert on these things, would be much less alarmist and level-headed. Maybe ask Dr. Carroll, Dr. May, Dr. Megan May for their opinion on the current state of COVID and mitigation efforts. Keep up the good work. That's Matt in Michigan. I fully agree. And that's why Dr. Aaron Carroll will join us tomorrow. Yeah, Aaron Carroll Day should be on Thursday. But now it's time for the rest of the headlines. It's time for your news dump, rapid fire headlines. And we've got a brand new jingle, as always something to look forward to from the great Pete Coe at Pete Coe, Coevo on the Twitter. Say hi to him if you haven't already. Tell him you appreciate these. It never gets old. And today's news dump jingle is inspired by a story from, speaking of Kim in Iowa, a news story that she tweeted out about a snake, a python, that was in a woman's car in Australia. And Kim wrote, "The things my nightmares are made of, reasons I live where the air hurts my face, and we have 3 fake springs." Well, Kim, thank you for that. And Pete Coe was inspired by that news story with the python in the car. Thanks to you. Here it is.
Backseat driving Aussie python looking rather plump. Will it constrict my trachea for today's news dump?
Oh, my God, it's horrible. By the way, that jingle was written by Dan McDonald, listener. So inspired by Kim, written by Dan, performed by Pete Coe. What a collaboration. What an amazing group and community that we've created together to get through life and have fun while we're doing it. Great job, guys. I absolutely love it and love you. All right, well, plenty of news stories to mention outside of the python in the car. And let's start in Idaho, where their legislature, their Republican-led legislature, passed a bill that seeks to prevent most abortions from occurring in Idaho, has just passed the state legislature and is headed to the governor's desk. The first in the country to be modeled after the recent Texas law that bans abortions after 6 weeks before many women even know that they are pregnant. Well, the Idaho bill prohibits abortions after 6 weeks and allows the father, grandparents, siblings, uncles, or aunts of the fetus to sue a medical provider who performs the procedure. There's a lot more to that story, and Idaho Democrats are obviously pretty pissed off, as are women's rights supporters. Now let's get to COVID, the BA.2 sublineage. Am I saying it right? It's like a variation of the Omicron variant, now making up nearly a quarter of the new COVID-19 infections nationwide. The CDC estimated Tuesday up from around 1 in 10 new cases just a week prior. So there's that. Speaking of COVID, Pfizer and BioNTech have sought authorization of a second coronavirus booster shot for people 65 and older. So that's big news yesterday. Now let's get off of that stuff and get to something a little bit lighter. I thought this was interesting to mention. The Rolling Stones are touring for the band's 60th anniversary. 60 is the name of the tour. It's going to take the band to 10 European countries, and it's been nicknamed the Steel Wheelchairs because it's supposedly advanced age of the British rockers. But 14 dates will include 2 dates in London and well, look into it if you want to go to one of the concerts. The Rolling Stones are back out. Also, the Senate approved, in a surprise move, unanimously approved a measure that would make daylight saving time permanent next year. The bipartisan bill, named the Sunshine Protection Act, would ensure Americans no longer have to change their clocks twice a year. The bill still needs the approval from the House and the signature of President Joe Biden, however, to become law, but that was a pretty big deal. Yesterday, I mentioned this guy who was going around shooting and killing homeless people in Washington, D.C. and New York. Well, police in D.C. said yesterday they arrested a suspect in a series of shootings targeting homeless people, and they believe one suspect is behind 5 shootings, 2 fatal, involving people experiencing homelessness between the 2 cities this month. So seems like they got a main suspect there. How about this? Mercedes is opening a battery plant in Alabama and adding 600 jobs. A new electric vehicle battery factory near Tuscaloosa will open next year. I think that's good news. Here's a weird story. Christian teacher was suspended for refusing to call students by their pronouns they use, and now she is suing. Last spring, this math teacher in Fort Riley, Kansas, at a middle school, called a student Miss to get the student attention at the end of class. And then after class, another classmate emailed the teacher to let her know that the student now used the he, him pronouns and a different first name. The next day, when the teacher used the student's last name, avoiding the new name or any pronouns at all, classmate grew frustrated, leaving a note on her desk accusing the teacher of being transphobic. The note ended with a remark on the classmate's own gender identity. And so anyway, it's a whole thing. It's an interesting case, and we'll see what Siegel and other scholars think about it. How about this one? Airlines are saying flyers are now flocking back. Despite higher ticket prices, airlines expect to be able to shake off higher fuel costs as travel demand remains strong. Is that you? Are you buying flights? Also saw this story yesterday, which I thought was awful. Now, men who consider themselves anti-feminists or male supremacists or incels, involuntary celibates, have killed dozens of people in attacks in recent years in this country, and more attention needs to be paid to the warning signs, according to the Secret Service of the United States in a report released Tuesday. I might even invite someone on to talk about that one. Now, let's get to one more lighter story, and then I got good news coming up from Ava. She's back. All right, the 10 most popular dog breeds are out, and guess what? Here they are. Number 10, Dachshunds. Number 9, German short-haired pointer. 8, Rottweiler. 7, Beagle. 6, Bulldogs. Oh, no. 5, Poodles. 4, German Shepherds. 3, Golden Retrievers. 2, French Bulldogs. No. And 1, Labrador Retriever. That is, according to the American Kennel Club's top 5 most popular dog breeds. For the first time in nearly a quarter century, Labrador Retrievers are up at the top, and Poodles strutting back for the top 5. That's what I was trying to say. That's weird. All right, well, now let's get to some good news. Let's head over to Ava. Ava, what do you have for us?
Thanks, Dad. Yes, I'm back. Sorry, I'm a little stuffy.
Yeah,
but
do you have the COVID? Do you have the Rona?
I don't think so.
Okay, good.
All right, well, here we are with some good news.
Could you sell it a little bit more? You seem to be not really caring. Let's go. All right, good again.
All right, here we are with some good news. Yeah. There hasn't been much good news coming out of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, but here's some. 3 premature babies have been safely transported from Ukraine to Poland as the Russia-Ukraine war continues. Project Dynamo, an American civilian and ally rescue nonprofit based in Tampa, launched a mission that successfully evacuated twin baby boys and 1 baby girl from Kiev on Monday, March 7th.
Wow.
The rescue mission, which the organization is calling Gemini...
Get it? Gemini? Because it's twins. It's the zodiac sign. Yeah.
That makes sense. It was accomplished with help from 2 doctors, 2 neonatal specialists, 1 nurse, and a Ukrainian ambulance crew, and comes 11 days after Russia launched its attack on Ukraine.
That is a good news story, and you always have to look for the helpers. You ever hear that? Look for the helpers?
Yeah, from you.
Well, I think Mr. Rogers said it first. Well, anyway, we'll talk about that. Always look for the helpers. In every terrible situation, there are always people helping, right?
Yes.
You didn't know that.
I did.
Because most people are...
good.
Love you. Thanks. Bye.
Love you too. Bye.
All right, there she goes, Ava, my 17-year-old high school junior, doing the good news. That is all for today's news dump. And now it's time to get to my guests. But before I do, I just want to thank listeners for subscribing. I can't do the show without you. Thank you very much for being a part of this community. And I hope that if you haven't signed up for a paid subscription yet, you consider it. You can always edit your pledge up like Bill O just did from $5 to $15. Wow, Bill, thank you very much. That means a lot and makes a huge difference to me and the show. So thank you very much, sir. I honor you. Also, thank you again. I'm going to give another shout out to Shannon White because she got so excited for yesterday's shout out that I'm giving it to you again. I see you, Shannon. I appreciate you, and it means a lot to me that you write such kind things about the show and all the work that I put into it. Thank you, Shannon White. Now, let's get to my first guest. All right, well, coming up, I should mention, I've got the great Thom Hartmann. He's got a new book out he's got a whole series of hidden history books, and this one's The Hidden History of Big Brother, all about privacy. Great interview with Thom Hartmann. But first, it's time for Big Barry Ritholtz. He's an author, he's a newspaper columnist, a blogger, an equities analyst, the CIO of Ritholtz Wealth Management, a commentator on Bloomberg TV, he's the host of the Bloomberg podcast Masters in Business, where he always interviews influential figures in markets, investing, and business. He's a regular here on the show, a really good, close personal friend of mine. Follow him on Twitter, where he's great, @Ritholtz. Subscribe to his daily reads as well as his podcast, like I said, Masters in Business. And listen now to the theme song that Gareth Sever wrote for him, and that he talked right over it at the top. You hear him calling his dog and telling his dog to come over. There's nothing I can do about it, but anyway, such a great song. Thank you, Gareth Sever. Here we go with the Ritholtz.
Hey, dog. Come on up. Sharp as a tack, understands the nuts and bolts of the inner workings of financial systems. He can build your wealth like he's on a mission. He drives a real nice car, and he's got another car, and so many more. What are they all for? He's barely holding back road rage all of the time. If you're sitting in the left lane or over the line, he knows the Dunning-Kruger effect is a sign of the times.
Ladies and gentlemen, there he is live from Long Island, Big Barry Ritholtz. Thank you, Gareth Sever. What a jingle. Barry, good to see you.
Dude, that could be the pinnacle of my accomplishments, is that jingle.
Yeah, that guy's a real talented singer, songwriter, and performer. And
lyricist. The lyrics crack me up. That's what makes it so funny.
Oh, yeah. The Dunning-Kruger effect. How do you work that into a song?
Not a lot rhymes with that.
Well, thank you very much for joining me. I have a lot of things to ask you and talk to you about. I wanted to start by talking about Putin's war in Ukraine, which of course you're following real closely. I know that you probably want to say something about the horror of it all. I want to get to some of the effects that you're watching and how that's affecting the world economy and more. But what do you want to start? Where do you want to start with when it comes to Putin's invasion to Ukraine?
So it just goes to show you that William Goldman, who is famous for having written Marathon Man and The Princess Bride and just all these great movies, he was absolutely right when he said nobody knows nothing. Yeah. Nobody knows anything. Yeah. You know, in his book, there's a section where he talks about Raiders of the Lost Ark was turned down by just about every studio. Star Wars, nobody wanted, a Western set in space. And, supposedly Putin was this strategic genius with unstoppable military. He's an isolated old man who's out of touch and is going to turn his own country into a pariah, turn his own legacy into that of a war criminal. And I think there's, we're right at the edge. And this is only going to go, maybe his military takes Kiev and they can subdue the Ukrainian people, but I'm not so sure that that happens. There's a tiny chance that the U.S. gets drawn into a hot shooting war with all the nuclear ramifications that are unthinkable over there. But there's also, on the other tail, is Russia becomes a pariah like North Korea, and their economy just crumbles. And, you know, it's a reminder that the rule of law and private property, democracy, democratic values, majority rules, all those things are valuable. And if you ignore them, you're doing so at your own risk. Maybe this is a different outcome if it's China invading Taiwan because it's a much bigger economy. Maybe this is a different outcome if Putin wasn't so paranoid and actually, you know, everybody always tries to draw these parallels to Hitler. There is a legitimate argument to be made that Germany could have won World War II if Hitler listened to his generals. It's a slim argument because they were really, you know, at a certain point, one little country, there's only so much they can do. There's only so many ships and tanks and planes they can make, especially when they're starting to run out of oil. But Putin is looking very isolated, and we'll see how this runs. But at the very least, the one thing we can certainly say is Putin's reputation as a military and strategic mastermind is being called into question these days.
That's for sure. That's for sure. What about how their oil affects commodities markets, affects gas, affects the price of everything? How closely are you following that? I see that oil has come down.
Yeah,
and
I just tweeted that earlier.
You tweeted something like the cure for high prices is high prices.
So that's an old commodities trader's expression, that the way things work in a free market is prices go up. And we saw this last year with lumber. Prices of wood went up because a lot of people decided, hey, I don't want to live in an apartment in the city during a pandemic. I'm going to buy a house. There aren't enough houses, so people start building houses. All the things that go into a house start to go up in price. Lumber doubles. But lumber, especially with Canada next door, lumber's really easy. Fred, go chop down some more trees. Take them to the mill. Suddenly, why? Well, prices doubled. Let's go sell some wood.
Why is Fred asking so many questions to the foreman, I think?
You know, he wants to make sure he's not cutting down too many trees. Okay. There are very specific forestry, husbandry rules.
Got it. All right.
So that every time they cut down a tree, they plant a new one. Right. It's actually shockingly sustainable, not what you typically think of in terms of natural resources, but they've figured out that it's more profitable to manage it appropriately. And so when the price spikes like it did, they go out and they cut down a ton of trees, and suddenly I got all the wood you want. How much you want? I got two down in the front. What do you want? And so suddenly now there's a ton of supply. The same thing arguably has already begun to happen in oil. Oil prices. So first of all, oil prices spiked back to where they were in 2007. Which, stop and think about it for a moment, for 15 years, we've had deflation in energy prices. What really isn't true. It was mostly deflation until about 14. Then it bounced up for a couple of years. Then it came back down. But essentially, what happens? So oil prices spike to 100 from like 75, and then they go to 125. Last week, they were 130. The Minister of Energy on Russia comes out and says, let's see how the West likes $300 a barrel oil. And then oil promptly falls 25% to under 100 today. It's like 102, 103 as we're speaking, but it was 99 earlier today. And why is that? Because at $130 a barrel after, hey, we've been getting 65, 75 for years. Wait, I could get double what I was getting? Sell the Westerners, sell the capitalist pigs some more oil. They'll pay $130. They will sell us the noose to hang ourselves. But as long as we have oil and we get double what we were getting, sell it. That's before the frackers start to do more. That's before Saudi Arabia starts to open more. That's before all of the marginal producers that aren't really, not every barrel of oil costs the same. What makes Saudi Arabia so amazing is the oil there costs about $4 or $5 a barrel because they know where it is. It's relatively easy to get at. It's relatively easy to transport, as opposed to you go 10,000 feet below the surface of the Pacific. That's expensive oil. To drop a platform in 3,000 feet of water and drill, and then have to drill another 3,000 feet underneath, that's not easy. That's expensive oil. And so, what do? You don't necessarily run the platform all out when oil is $50 a barrel. But over $100, hey, turn the spigots on, and the cure for high prices is high prices. It brings more supply to the market, and more supply eventually drives the prices lower.
What do you make of the argument that is both an energy discussion as well as a geopolitical discussion, and it comes up all the time? It's we need to not be dependent on foreign energy for obvious reasons, especially because so much of the foreign energy comes from bad actors, and even more importantly, it's all terrible for the planet to continue to burn it. So on the right, they're constantly just talking about, build the Keystone Pipeline and drill here, drill now, and we won't have to worry about it. And obviously the rest of us are arguing for renewable energy investments. And what do you make of when you hear that argument? What do you...
So two things. First, the U.S. is a net exporter of energy. Right. We send more oil and natural gas away than we bring in. We're not reliant on Russian oil. If Russian oil makes 3% of our total energy picture, it's because we've elected, as part of some bullshit trade deal, to say, yeah, we'll buy some of your shitty Soviet-era oil. Fine, we'll take some of that off your hand. But we certainly don't need it, as opposed to Europe, which is 30 to 40% natural gas and oil comes from their eastern neighbor, Russia. So that's one issue. The U.S. is effectively energy independent, and we could become more energy independent if we basically created more incentives for solar and geothermal, which are right now we've transitioned the vast majority of electricity production away from coal, the dirtiest of the carbon products. But it's moved, hold aside hydroelectric and that stuff, because we've been doing that for a long time. It's moved in large part away from coal, and to a lesser degree away from diesel and home heating oil, to natural gas, which is supposedly less dirty. I don't want to say clean. Clean gas is sort of a contradiction. It's not really, and
it's really not less dirty.
Nothing is as dirty as coal.
I think that's right. I think it's. Right. But I think it's got
gun to the head. Natural gas is going to be
footprint with all the transportation of it. Not to mention it being methane.
Well, nat gas, you do a pipeline, but you also, the problem with nat gas is you release a lot of methane in the production of nat gas.
Right.
And
right.
That sticks around for a long time. But that said, natural gas is likely to be a transitional energy as we move towards renewables. And keep in mind that lots of the country doesn't have sufficient wind and solar to provide electricity 24/7, especially at peak periods. So
did you hear about what they're doing in Florida? They're letting the incentives sunset because the Republican legislators and some Democrats are so heavily influenced by Florida Power and Light, the kind of public-private energy lobby, that the Sunshine State is no longer going to incentivize solar panels, and less than maybe 3%, I think, of homes, might be smaller, have them on the rooftop solar.
So that just goes to show you how damaging the Citizens United and other cases have been.
Yeah.
That the Romans, if someone was caught lobbying a senator and giving them compensation to get a vote, they would be tied naked in a gunny sack with a wildcat. Their nose would be cut off. The sack would be tied closed and be thrown off a bridge into a river. I am not making that up. The Romans did not take this sort of political corruption. Go grab any random Carl Hiaasen book, not the ones he wrote for kids, but the adult books.
Yeah.
And the entire backdrop of, they're like my favorite vacation beach reading because they're hilarious and really well written. but simultaneously tell a tale of just corruption. The sugar people, the real estate people.
Right.
Florida makes Chicago and New Jersey look like Disneyland. It's Florida
in terms
is its
of corruption and the type of corruption.
Right. But not from the 30s and 40s. I mean, Tuesday.
Right.
And in the right now, there's a very, very tight race for America's dumbest governor. And you can't handicap that race without DeSantis throwing his hat into the ring.
Well,
no matter who you bring up, the woman from one of the Dakotas, Nikki Haley, Abbott from Texas, no matter how terrible and awful these human beings are, as either elected officials or just people, a lot of these folks, it's not that I disagree with them politically. They're terrible human beings. Yeah. I mean, Florida is the only state I'm aware of that does not require their kids to get some form of COVID vaccination. It's completely off the list. And that's just pandering. That's the worst sort of pandering. And DeSantis has shown he's a slightly craftier version of Donald Trump.
Right.
So the answer to the question, what happens if you have someone who's as terrible a human being as Trump, but a hair smarter? That's Ron DeSantis. And I'm just rooting for, him not to go further in his political career.
Everybody, you're not alone. But I like that at your website, the big picture, you have this graphic. Where's it from? Of corruption by country rankings by country experts and business leaders.
That's from. Let me pull this up.
I wish people thought more about, and I'm sure there's an author expert. Maybe you've interviewed him on your podcast, Masters in Business or somewhere else. Experts in corruption, because I think different people define it differently. You're talking to a guy in the break room, at the Ford assembly line, versus you're talking to a scholar about the issue and studies corruption. I mean, what is corruption? And I think the most obvious form, when I mentioned Florida and you mentioned Citizens United, is large industries kind of colluding with a lobbyist group, paying a group to advocate on behalf of them, write the laws that benefit their industry, no matter what it is. That's the kind of corruption we have, at least in America, most commonly. What else do you think of when you think of American corruption?
So first, to answer your question, how do you measure corruption?
Yeah.
There's an entity called Transparency International, and they do an annual survey all around the world about the Corruption Perception Index on a 0 to 100 basis. And basically, they look at human rights and democracy and economic freedoms, and they ask about all these questions, and they come up with a number. It's kind of ironic that, Denmark and Finland and Norway and Sweden tend to be at the top every year. You could throw in Singapore and New Zealand there. Singapore's kind of interesting because they have horrifically strict rules.
Yeah.
But the thing about Singapore is they apply to everybody. There's not a special political elite that, I have a little badge that I was gifted by an officer's family years ago. And sometimes I get pulled over going a little too fast. Sometimes it helps. That sort of stuff doesn't happen in Singapore. Their rules are just, it's a little bit of a philosopher king, an autocrat who is beneficent autocrat. And Singapore is consistently considered one of the least corrupt countries in the world. On the other hand, hey, us here in the U.S., we've kind of slipped a bit. We're down to, on that rating, we're down to 67. You look years ago, we were closer to, the best of Europe. And for a variety of reasons, some of which include our making it more difficult to vote, especially for minorities and people of color. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back for things like gay rights and marriage equality and all sorts of issues with that. But the other thing is, how hard is it to set up a business and run a business without someone from the government coming out with their hand out for a payoff? And for the most part, the U.S. is pretty good about that.
Right.
I mean, they'll try and whack you with taxes. That said, every industry will tell you stories about things.
Sure.
You know, real estate is notorious. Construction is notorious for having to grease the skids, shall we say, to get
How
certain
about
things.
this one? I was talking to my dad about this as I saw some guy in my community post this. You're from the Northeast. Do you think there is a bit of a scam with the highway department or the roads department? Because in the winter, they drop that big shovel and they scrape the pavement and they rip it all up. They salt it all up. And then they even, once the snow is done falling, they get overtime pay. They just keep running those plows and salting. And then in the summer, they fix it all up and they get overtime for fixing up all the damage they did in the winter, is a theory that I have come up with.
Yeah, so if you remember...
I say this to you, if you know anything, and if anybody listening knows anything and wants to call me a terrible person for making this assumption, please tell me. I'd like to know if anybody knows anybody in the roads.
Do you remember a couple of years ago, there was a snowstorm in New York, and the mayor kind of dawdled in getting the snow cleared? Everybody wanted his head. I mean, people went berserk.
Right. I do remember that. Yeah.
When you look at the responsibilities of local government, hey, if you have to get to the hospital, you have to take your kids to school, you have to go to the supermarket, the roads have to be passable and safe. Forget maintained like an adult normal society. Let's hold that aside. But, you know, if the roads have to be cleared, you live in the Northeast, the problem isn't the guys salting and shoveling and then patching. The problem is that the gasoline tax has been the same since, 91 or 93? It's 30 years, whatever it is. While prices for everything have gone up, hey, everybody loves the bright, shiny object when you make a new highway or a new bridge or something, but you have to maintain these. You have to make sure that there is... repainting bridges nobody gets the glory. There's no ribbon cutting ceremony for fixing potholes. But if you don't do it, it just gets worse and worse and worse. Thank goodness this administration finally got an infrastructure package passed. If you saw 60 Minutes this week, they went in great detail with Mayor Pete Buttigieg, the transportation secretary, about how all this money is being spent. And part of the problem is that we waited 25, 30 years past when we should have done it. So stuff that should cost $1 million costs $3 million, not just because of inflation, but because the damage is so much worse. And there are lots of bridges that can't be repaired. They just have to be completely replaced. So I'm not buying that. In the Northeast and in parts of, anything above, when you look at Minnesota, when you look at Chicago, when you look at that part of the country, roads get the crap beat out of them. Boston.
All right. Well, anybody else that wants to punch holes in that ridiculous theory that I came up with, let me know. Just in terms of the corruption.
This doesn't mean that you should not be doing the appropriate
oversight
maintenance all along. A well-maintained road can withstand some salt and some plowing.
Yeah. I'm just in terms of talking about corruption. Let me ask you, though, I got to make sure we talk about inflation and the Fed. A lot of news around the Fed and inflation. When you look at economic numbers and you look at jobs the unemployment rate is extremely low. The economy is on fire. Wages are way up and labor has bargaining power for the first time, potentially our generation. However, everything costs more because of inflationary pressures, I think generally as a result of the COVID-created supply chain issues. But now, in addition, because of COVID in China, as well as the war, maybe invasion, I don't know how much that has to do with it. And now we have to talk about interest rates. And I don't even know why we have to talk about interest rates right now.
So first, I just shared a link with you. The CARES Act, that the first one was passed under President Trump in March, April 2020. Then there was a second version. Then there was a third version under President Biden. At the peak, we were issuing $1.4 trillion in unemployment insurance disbursements. It has since fallen 98% to about $27 billion, which sounds like a tiny number compared to $1.395 trillion, but still. It just gives you a sense. That was a 4,903% jump from the prior year. Just gives you a sense of how much the government prevented the economy from collapsing. And that led to a couple of things. First, when everybody was stuck at home, they started ordering goods instead of services. And what I mean by that is you get a home bike or a treadmill instead of going to the gym. You're ordering DVDs or watching streaming instead of going to the movies. You're doing takeout instead of going to the supermarket. So it was just a series of goods over services compared to going to the supermarket instead of going to a restaurant.
Right.
And normally we're about a 60% service, 40% goods economy. And this shifted so much that that's part of the supply chain issue. That was one of the issues. The other thing is, and I don't know if you've been out and about, if you've been out of your she shed recently, but by us, everything is now pretty much reopened.
Yeah.
I saw Al Franken the other night. Maybe there was 10% of the people wearing a mask.
You went out and saw him doing stand-up? He's doing a stand-up tour?
Yeah. Very funny. Surprisingly interesting, funny.
Yeah.
Told some really interesting stories. Also told some hilarious, he tells a story about Buddy Hackett and Shecky Green and tells some like old Borscht Belt jokes that were really hilarious. But like the world is reopening. The world is, the restaurants were all full. My wife, who's been as conservative about COVID as anybody, she was out shopping with her sister the other day at a couple of stores and said they were all pretty busy on the weekend. So now you have the economy reopening. That's going to add some inflationary pressure. On top of all that, people are stuck home for a year and you're paying their bills. A lot of those people said, I want to do better than this crappy job I have, this crappy entry-level retail or food service or hospitality job. And a lot of those people got new training, new skills, new certifications, and they've left the food service industry. They've left the lawn and yard care industry. They've left, basic hospitality and restaurants, and they've moved into better paying fields. And so there's a shortage of those low end salary. Keep in mind, and I don't know if we talked about this last time, but I've been writing about it. We have artificially constrained the entry level wage for 30 years.
Yes.
That the minimum wage has lagged. It's lagged inflation. It's lagged productivity. It's lagged corporate profits. It's lagged C-suite comp. Like it's lagged everything. And so we don't really talk about this much, but we have artificially held down inflation courtesy of the lowest paid workers in the country not seeing an increase despite being the lowest paid workers. And so that kind of, a lot of things in finance and the economy kind of go up slowly. This sort of stair-stepped, and it's very jarring when you go from $8 to $15 practically in 3 or 4 quarters, but really it was 20 years late. It should have been going up a little bit every year, and it would have been less painful, but then inflation would have been higher over that period.
So what's happening now with the Fed and interest rates? I'm hearing that the chairman, I mean, it's not him, he's making a decision with everybody on the board, right? Has kind of a tough decision to make, but there's no doubt analysts, experts saying it's interest rates are going up. What does that mean? Buy something now?
Not necessarily. I think automobile prices a year from now will be the same or lower. I don't think they'll be much higher. And I suspect home prices are not going to keep going up at this price. Part of the reason home prices have been going up as much as they have is because there's no supply. Either people don't want to move. Normally there's a ton of new home built, 700, 800, 900,000 units built a year and a decent amount of inventory out there. Lots of people aren't ready, don't want to move. And there has been an underbuilding, which is starting to reverse of houses. And so, I don't know, a year from now, 2 years from now, I think the housing market will have settled down is my best guess. That said, the Fed had rates very low for way too long. After the financial, so I last week I wrote something about 2 different types of government response to crisis. Following the great financial crisis, Congress really didn't do a whole much on the fiscal side, leaving the Fed as the only game in town. They did it on a monetary side, meaning The Fed took rates as low as they could, down as low as they could, but the Congress really didn't spend a lot of money to make up for the shortfall caused by the deep recession and the lack of household and business spending. The playbook is you do both. We've known that for a century.
Right.
This isn't a surprise.
Right.
But, you know, the bullshit deficit hawks come out and they can't say, hey, black guy's president, we're not going to spend money.
Right.
So they have to say, well, you know, the debt is that we created through wars and tax cuts is too high, and therefore we can't deficit spend. To be fair, there was about less than $800 billion fiscal stimulus, but it was nonsense. It was a temporary extension of tax cuts, a temporary extension of unemployment, and like $200 or $230 billion in fiscal stimulus. Compared that to $3 trillion from the CARES Act, and then another $1 or $2 trillion from the infrastructure spend. Hey, that's fiscal stimulus. And to some degree, some of that is causing some inflation, but very little, because the Fed could raise rates. It's not going to get chips out faster to build cars.
Right.
It's not going to get more you want to build a transport ship. It's a 3-year process. You want to build some containers for that ship. You need the space for it. You need the ship for it. You can't just build containers and then say, all right, let me put a container ship worth of containers here and wait 3 years. So there are a lot of issues that we're like a third to halfway through resolving. A lot of that has been the shift to goods, which I expect to go back. You know, people were building backyard entertainment centers and fire pits and outdoor barbecue and outdoor TVs instead of going on vacation, getting on a plane and going to a hotel somewhere. Right. So all that stuff has to get shipped here from somewhere. So that stuff will start to normalize. So the Fed has two issues they have to deal with. They should probably be off of this zero interest rate footing they've been on pretty much since the end of the financial crisis. In like 2017, 2018, they started raising a little bit, and then the market had a hissy fit, and then they had a cut during the pandemic. But they certainly overstayed their welcome in terms of 0% interest rate last time, not because of inflation, but just to get to a more normalized footing. And part of the reason they were so slow in doing that was because Congress failed to come up with a sufficient fiscal package to deal with the crisis. And so what was the result? Very subpar recovery, weak retail sales, weak housing sales, soft employment, modest at best wage gains.
You're talking about what time period now?
From the end of the financial crisis in 2009 through, let's call it 2015 or so. Yeah. The economy finally started to rev up a little bit. Yeah. Some people will argue 2014, some people argue 2016. And then in, again, another flip of logic, in 2017, when the economy was pretty hot, 15, 16, 17, the economy was heating up, the Trump administration passed $1.7 trillion, $1.3 trillion tax cut, which supercharged it. Some of this inflation traces back to that, but not a lot. But that's called pro-cyclical. What you want to be is counter-cyclical, meaning in 08, 09, when the household sector and the business sector freezes and isn't spending, that's when the government should step in. When the economy is doing great and there's no shortage of demand, that's when you balance the budget. That's when you ease back on spending, you increase taxes a little bit, and you bring the deficit down. What Trump did was, like everything Trump does, was not for the country's best interest, but it certainly juiced the economy under his watch. And we're paying for that today in terms of that deficit and whatever, inflationary impact that has. But I don't think that's a significant part of the inflation picture here. So does the Fed want to raise rates aggressively with this war going on? If the Fed takes rates up to 1 or 2%, is that going to make the price of oil come down? No, that's yet another thing. By the way, Ukraine and Russia account for something like 24% of the wheat and soy exports around the world. And
specifically
they're giants.
Specifically to certain countries that will suffer more for not getting it.
Right.
Apparently. Yeah.
So the Fed raising rate is not going to really do much for that sort of inflation. they should plan on getting off of zero. They should plan on normalizing Federal Open Market Committee rate policy. But that said, people are looking for like a magic bullet to kill inflation. We're still in the middle of what is very likely to be a transitory process, regardless of what the Fed does, unless the Fed raises rates enough to cause a recession. And when you get a recession, inflation tends to drop also.
All right, here at the end, do you want to tell me something about investor behavior right now when people are looking away from the pandemic and starting to, quote, normalize new normal? Do you want to mention anything about housing, the automobile market, jobs, anything else? Spin the wheel, pick a topic that I haven't brought up, asked you about, and rant away, Ritholtz.
So essentially, you know, I was on vacation in February, and I went to the Caribbean, where they require proof of vaccination and a negative PCR test, and not like, here's my fake COVID card. You have to link everything to a real government entity, and it was legit. And when we got there, there was still, Omicron was still tailing off, but it was the first time in like, since Omicron came, that I took off my mask. I relaxed. I felt pretty good. We went out to dinner. You know, lots of people around. It felt like almost normal. And we get back to New York, and the Omicron numbers had just finished. While we were gone, they just plummeted to zero. And so we kind of like a turtle sticking our head out of the shell. We look around and, oh, look, things are normalized. And so I started writing, hey, here's what's going to happen. If this continues, this is an economic boom. There's so much cash. There's so many people employed. And like 2 days later, Russia invaded Ukraine. So the entire frame of reference is based on that. And so when that happened, I went out and I did my research, something I've researched before because my office was headquartered at Two World Trade. I was in Long Island on September 11th in 2001. But I did a bunch of research, and you pretty much find that the market doesn't care about war because, for the most part, war doesn't affect corporate revenues. War doesn't affect profits that much. You still need food. You still need energy. You're going to buy weapons. So perversely, the market kind of shrugs it off, even though everybody panics. And despite all the terrible headlines, I'm going to just pull up this chart, so I'll give you.
Well, what about like companies like Pepsi, Coke, McDonald's? Don't they lose? Or are there...
what do they lose?
Don't they lose business by pulling out or closing down?
Out of Russia?
Yeah.
Let me ask you a question. How much do you think Russia...
what percentage of the profits for McDonald's?
It's next to nothing.
Right. So it's not even a blip in any real big industry or chain or companies... global profits. I mean, if they're a global actor like Delta Airlines, it's not.
Well, there are certain airlines that have planes in Russia, and they'll never get those back, and they'll be in litigation with their insurance carriers forever as to who owes for that. And I think BP took like a $5 billion write-down. They just said, we're done. We're out of Russia, which was really, they were one of the first. They were very aggressive, very quick. I know people from BP Amoco from years ago, and I heard stories 20 years ago. Russia is a organized crime syndicate with a standing army attached to it.
Right, for sure.
And so this was just an excuse to say everybody there is a corrupt individual. We can't get drawn because of the Corrupt Companies Act. We can't be seen dropping off, briefcases full of cash to these oligarchs. The interesting thing is all of there's a giant loophole in the U.S. that allows Russian oligarchs and other bad players to launder dirty money by bringing it through buying U.S. properties. And New York and Miami are notorious for that. And everybody thinks it's Trump, but it's not just Trump Towers. That was one of many places.
Plenty of real, right. Yes.
Right. It's a ton. Although certainly you understand his affinity for the Russians because, they wildly overpay for property. They don't care. They just want to get the money the hell out of Russia and into the Western world.
Right.
The really interesting, back to where we started with Putin as a strategic genius. The really interesting miscalculation is all these oligarchs, they used to call London Stan. I mean, that up until very recently, because so many of these unbelievably beautiful townhouses and penthouses that cost tens of millions and in some cases hundreds of millions of dollars were owned by these Russian oligarchs, which you're going to assume that a lot of this money is dirty. All these places are in the process of being confiscated. Nobody needs a $500 million yacht. You know me. I like fast cars. I like fast boats. I like jets that go. Nobody needs a $500 million yacht. You don't need $100 million. You could get a very nice boat, as nice as anything in the world, for less than $10 million. So the only reason to build $1 billion boat is because you want to get $1 billion out of your country and you have no other way to do it.
Well,
so these
there's
are just
that, and to some extent, there is just a dick measuring competition amongst.
at a certain point, when Johnny Holmes is way in your rearview mirror, there's no. It's beyond dick. Listen, if you want to build a dick measuring competition, you make your rocket ship shaped like a penis.
Well, yes,
and you send it up into orbit.
That's
the thing. But that money is spent. You don't get that money back. A physical good that costs that much, and when you sell it, you only get half of what it costs to build. What do you give a shit? It's all stolen money. It's all dirty, corrupt money. So the only possible reason to build a naval vessel that belongs in a navy is to launder the money. And I think that business is coming to an end. And a lot of those ships are in the process of being seized. The guy who used to track Elon Musk's plane, because all these planes have public transponders and have to file flight plans. Great. So he has shifted to tracking oligarch yachts around the world, and different countries are in the process of seizing them, which, again, it comes back to, if you watch any of the period pieces about the French royals or the British royals, you learn that the monarchy essentially serves at the pleasure of the nobility around them. In other words, the king and queen are in the castle. I didn't know any of this stuff. I watched, we watched The Crown and we watched Reign and we watched all these other things during lockdown. And you learn, really, the king and queen are powerless. They serve at the pleasure of God and the church and the nobility. The nobility is the one who provides the soldiers and the food. And, so there have been coups throughout history because you can't piss off all the people who are paying the bills.
Right.
And the big question is, has the West's response to the invasion of Ukraine, is that going to lead to the nobility around the Russian king? Is that going to lead to a coup?
Which leads us back to exactly where you started, because most people are saying no one can get close to him. No one would do it. But as
not at that big table. The 40-foot table is
crazy. Crazy.
Imagine being a waiter there. More water, please. The guy's got to be a marathoner to deal with that. That's a horrible thing.
He doesn't know. He's not. The waiter doesn't run all the way up to Putin. He just puts it down and slides
it. Right. It's like like a beer in a bar. It just goes straight down.
First, he has to taste it, though, because he doesn't want
So someone, I forgot who said this. Someone said, you need a slow-acting poison so it doesn't kill the taster. He dies the next day.
Yes, I'm for that.
I don't care how smart anyone and knowledgeable any one person is. You know, a team is always going to be more effective than a single person. And because a team brings in different expertises and different experiences and different perspectives, and you end up with a better decision-making process. And when you have a, team of rivals, the famous Doris Goodwin book, but when you have an oligarch, when you have an autocrat who's running everything by himself because he doesn't trust the people around him, you end up with, not great information, not good decision-making, and terrible outcomes.
And history has shown us where those guys usually end up, in a drainage ditch.
Well, I think when you look at the Saddam Hussein or the
Gaddafi, Mussolini, Hitler, come on, who do you want?
I think Putin doesn't expect that to happen. And I think he's probably right. If anybody does anything with Putin, he'll walk into an ambush and, it'll be a lot of people pulling the trigger. But he seems to be hunkered down and not leaving the Kremlin or wherever he's holed up. He is not out in front of he's not in Red Square. They're not driving the tanks by. He's kind of...
Well, they don't have any tanks left. They're all in Ukraine, apparently.
So as we keep learning from a military perspective,
crazy
attack is much more difficult than defense, especially when you have a poorly trained army that isn't enthusiastic about what this is, and half of them don't know what's going on. And the latest, greatest technology, the Javelin. Did we talk about this? The Javelin and the Stinger last time?
The most important, I feel like, detail to me that I've ever learned in talking about this, and I talked with experts on insurgency way back in the days, is that if Ukraine, and they will, has a robust insurgency, and they have every incentive to, there's no way you can hold that country, or rather certain cities.
You need them 2 million soldiers, and Russia doesn't have that.
You can flatten the city. They're still going to...
Right. They're underground. They're in the woods.
I mean, maybe they will. Maybe they'll try to kill them all somehow from above. But, yeah, I mean, they're going to have and if he does, what a horrible... It'll be that much worse for him. So.
Plus, when you look at... Here's the advantage in modern warfare of defense over offense, at least in a ground war. In a ground war, those tanks cost, $5 and $10 million, and those Stinger and Javelin missiles are $100,000 each.
Right.
And, the U.S. is funding these as a much. We did it once before. The reason the Soviet Union fell wasn't because our military was so much better than their military. It was because our economy was capable of affording that military, and their economy was not. This is the same sort of structure in miniature. I'm not sure that the Russian economy has the ability to withstand the sort of
That's what I
sanctions.
keep saying. That's what I keep thinking. I'm surprised I'm not hearing more.
But what is this, day 18, day 19?
Yeah.
6 months from now is a very different story. And while the body count will go up and the number of people, fleeing will have gone up, 6 months. Time is not on Russia's side.
No.
Time is always on the defense side, unless you're going to do a siege warfare and starve them out. But, it's a porous country, and I think they've done a good job so far getting supplies into the insurgents so far. So we'll see. Who knows? You can't judge by what you see on CNN.
Right,
That's
and there's all kinds
accurate.
of military analysts that clearly have gotten it wrong in terms of overrating Russia, underrating Ukraine. And
For sure.
Hard to know who to trust. All right, Beth. Well, I appreciate, as always, you talking to me. Great conversation. Covered a lot of ground. Thank you very much for all of your help.
My pleasure. Anytime.
All right, there he goes, Ritholtz. Add Ritholtz on Twitter. Follow him on there and subscribe to his newsletter as well as his podcast, Masters in Business in the Bloomberg Network. And now, time to get to my second guest. But I got something fun to tell you because that was kind of depressing ending. So yesterday so my daughters played a little sports. They played some sports growing up. I played a lot of sports, all the sports growing up, specifically in high school, soccer, lacrosse, skiing. But my daughters, they dabbled with baseball and soccer when they were really young. But then they went into dancing, and they got serious about dancing for like 10 years. And then Ava still dances a little bit, but she's not serious about it. She just does it for fun and exercise. But Julia, who is going to be, she's in 8th grade, she's going to be in 9th grade next year. She played volleyball last year and this year. And now for 8th grade, she's playing lacrosse, which I just never expected. Now, again, that's my sport. I grew up in Syracuse, and it's really exciting to see her seriously, like taking it seriously on her own. So yesterday, here's what I want to tell you. Yesterday, I get done with my interview with Thom Hartmann, which you're about to hear, and I run out of the shed, and Julia's in the baseball field through the woods behind my house, but it's not far, and you can yell to her. And I yelled to my daughter. She's over there with her friend playing catch with their lacrosse stick. And I yelled, "Can I play?" That's what I yelled. I yelled, "Can I play?" And they said, "Yeah, come on over." And so I realized I hadn't yelled the phrase, "Can I play?" since I was like 10. And I went over and I played with them, and then Julia's friend left, and then it was just Julia and I, and it was a beautiful afternoon, and it was peak happy, folks. So just wanted to share that with you. Yesterday I was peak happy, and I'm just really excited that she's playing lacrosse. No pressure. She doesn't care if she's great. She's like, I just want to do something, make some new friends. She's such a great kid, Julia. Both of them are. And I'm such a great, lucky dad to have them. All right, now that happy, inspiring, personal moment is over, I want to bring on Thom Hartmann, who is probably the most well-known progressive radio talk show host in the country. He has been around longer than anyone that you know that is well-known, that's popular, that's a progressive commentator. There's a whole new breed and school and generation of progressive commentators, but Thom Hartmann has always been one of the best. He has also written like over 30 books, and you can hear his radio show any day, everywhere. Just go to thomhartmann.com to find out where. And you can get his new book. It's called The Hidden History, part of the Hidden History series of books, The Hidden History of Big Brother. You can also subscribe to the Hartmann Report, which is on Substack, and so much more. We talked about his new book and a few other things. I was really glad to catch up with Thom, and I hope you'll tell him that you heard him here on the show. Ladies and gentlemen, the legend, Thom Hartmann.
I first pitched the idea of a series of small books to BK. The point that I made was that I just, for books this size, I just don't have the bandwidth anymore to read an entire book. And I think that I'm not unique in that. And so I wanted to come up with books this size, little pocket books that somebody could read on a Saturday afternoon or over the weekend and get through, and that aren't stuff full of filling. Sometimes you have a couple of really great core ideas, and then the publisher says, well, add another 60,000 words to that. Well, these are 35,000 word books. So, whereas a normal book is 60, 70, 80. Some of my books have been over 100,000 words. I think the times have changed. People don't have the time. People don't have the patience.
Yeah, I feel like I don't know if it's time, if it's patience, or if it's just you're getting an alert on your phone and you get distracted and you go pick up the phone. And then the next thing you know, you're in your yard.
Exactly. Yeah. We've become an ADD society.
Well, you've written a lot about that, too. I mean, do you think that's just technology? Do you think that anything ever changes before we're all partially wired up droids in terms of our attention span? How can we do better? How do you do it? How do you pay attention and write these books, book after book, your show and everything else?
Well, you just put one foot ahead of the other. I mean, if you write every day, you will write. I mean, if you write 1,000 words a day, you'll write a couple books a year. It's just really that simple. And yeah, I've written a bunch of books on ADHD, and I think that there is a neurological baseline that makes some people more ADD and other people more bookkeeper-like. I call them farmers, very focused people. But, the problem isn't that spectrum of attentional mechanisms in humanity. The problem is the way as a society we react to it. We've pathologized the ADD part of it and said only the bookkeeper part of it is good. Only the farmer part is good, and the hunter part, the ADHD folks are dysfunctional. And the real problem is that our schools are set up like assembly lines or like farms. They're designed for that careful, methodical, slow, steady, quiet, and that's not how some of us are wired.
That's such an important conversation that I've heard you lead and talk about over the years, and of course write about the hidden history of guns, monopolies, American oligarchy, so relevant right now. All of these the hidden history of American healthcare, the war on voting, and the Supreme Court, and the betrayal of America. These are I think I mentioned all of your hidden history series books. The new one is about Big Brother, and that is to do with privacy, how the death of privacy and the rise of surveillance threaten us and our democracy. Thom Hartmann, again, congratulations. I'm learning a lot, as I always do, reading you, listening to your show. And does the Constitution have the word privacy in it anywhere?
No, and there's a good reason for that. Back in the 1770s, 1780s, the word privacy meant something completely different. We typically, what we refer to as toilets, were not indoors, they were outdoors, or if they were indoors, they were in a very, very segregated part of the house. And of course, there was no bathtub in there. That was typically in the kitchen where the hot water was heated. Our modern bathrooms are the result of indoor plumbing and hot water heaters. which didn't exist in the 1780s. And so if you needed to use the toilet, you would say, excuse me, I need a moment of privacy, or I need some privacy. And you'd get up and go out to the outhouse. And that's why to this day, we refer to outhouses as privies. So privacy back then meant, going to the toilet. And the founders just didn't really think that that was something that needed to be written into the Constitution. They did understand the concept of what we today call privacy. It appears in the First Amendment, and your right to speak, and your right to public assembly, and your right to organize public assembly in private, and your right to choose not to speak. It's in the Third Amendment, in our right not to have to quarter soldiers in our home, not to, the sanctity of our home. It's big time in the Fourth Amendment that you have the right to security, which was the word they used back then for what we call privacy, in your home, person, papers, and personal effects. In the Fifth Amendment, in your right not to testify against yourself. And arguably in the Ninth Amendment, where it says that, if there's any rights that we didn't name here, that means that they still are the property of the people rather than the nation.
Such an important insight, and the way that you explain it, of course, in the book. Let's try this one on. Reading the book and hearing you detail all of the different ways companies can now watch us and see us and almost touch us. Thom, you're overly concerned here. Listen, I like it. I went to the parking garage the other day, and they already have my phone number in the machine, so they just text me. I don't even need a piece of paper. That's sustainable. I like the Easy Pass. I don't have to stop and throw change at a bucket. I'm not bothering anybody. They can collect my information and build whatever they want, and maybe they're feeding me up the type of underwear and gadgets that I want. What are you so worried about, Thom Hartmann?
Well, there's a lot of convenience that has come along with the internet and the Internet of Things. That's absolutely true, and your point is well taken, Pete. That said, for example, back in 2016, when Donald Trump was running for president, and again in 2018, Ted Cruz did the same thing with the same company. This company, Cambridge Analytica, took thousands of data points about every one of us, figured out our personal fears and ambitions and hopes and likes and dislikes, and distilled them down into a series of very deceptive campaign ads to sell us Donald Trump. For example, you're a person who uses Easy Pass. Well, they had over 150,000 variations of one ad, basically arguing that the Republican and Democratic Party were both corrupt and you shouldn't even bother voting, which was how, it was very successful, by the way. They just in Milwaukee, they suppressed the vote by 50,000 votes, and Trump only won Wisconsin by 27,000 votes. And they could have done it. Now, nobody knows what was actually in those 150,000 different variations from one day, the day of the debates. But it averaged around 50,000 variations a day. But it could have been something like, hey, here's Pete driving with his Easy Pass and saying, oh, now probably wouldn't use that because you don't have a strong emotional connection to it.
Right.
But maybe your dog, or maybe your partner, or maybe,
they had ads. They had made ads based on information that people had put up on the internet, on Facebook or anywhere else.
Highly personalized. That's correct. Yep.
And Cambridge Analytica, a lot of people have heard of that company. And I interrupted you there, but that company and the way that other companies are able to find all of these data points about us. What does that mean? You're pointing to the concern in terms of direct marketing, in this case, a political ad. What's so wrong with that? Or direct marketing something else?
Here's how I distinguish it, Pete. Years ago, I was down in Peru hanging out with some shaman up in the Andes and was chewing coca with them, coca leaf. And, the buzz I got was about half as strong as a good cup of coffee. It's just, it's no big deal. It's a very mild stimulant. I was in the Far East and I smoked opium, and again, same deal. It was not that different from, actually, it wasn't even as strong as a Tylenol 3 in terms of pain killing, effect, because it's fairly mild stuff. But if you take coca or if you take opium and you distill it down to its purest essence, you've got something that it can hook deep inside you so powerfully that it can ruin your life. And that's what's happening with our lives, with our humanity, with our relationships. these companies, the social media companies and the advertising companies, they're looking deep into our lives for the things that they can hook us with and boiling that down as carefully and as completely as they can to the point that it's irresistible, that it actually it produces essentially what behaviorists or psychologists refer to as an addiction response, heavily mediated by things like our dopamine response or our adrenaline response.
Right.
And so they have taken a natural substance, essentially, conversation, relationships, family, and turned it into heroin or crack cocaine.
Talk to me about the history part of this, because I mean, you're detailing your concerns here, and we could go on and on about it, and you write about them in the book, and there's so many here. But I'm glad that you did the more kind of comprehensive about what's happening to our humanity, what's happened to our life force each and every day as you see some kind of ad flashed at you, which for me, the usual negative consequences that I'm not doing enough. Oh, there's Thom Hartmann. He just published his 4,000th book, and I can't even post on Instagram that I did a show today. It's like you feel inadequate. That kind of a thing is what you're describing. There's far more dangerous issues, national security issues that you go into as well. But I just want to get a little perspective here in terms of how far we've come from the telephone and the disparity on rules there to how things are different, say, in Europe because of government regulations and net neutrality, et cetera.
Right. In Europe, they've put into place rules and regulations that protect your privacy. One is called the right to be forgotten. If you find, negative things about you in search results, you can ask search engines to remove them. And by law, they have to in the European Union.
There goes all of my comedy albums.
Another is the, a lot of people, as they're surfing the web these days, they keep getting, will you accept cookies? Well, that's because of this law in Europe that says that you must disclose if you are tracking people and exactly how you're tracking them. Because you can also, there's a button you can click to give me more details on those cookies. So, they've tightened that down. Another thing is there is a doctrine in common law that literally goes back to the Magna Carta or that era, literally 1,000 years ago. And the doctrine is sometimes referred to as the castle doctrine, that a man's home is his castle.
Right,
is the way they say it 400 years ago. And but that's one side of it. The flip side of it is that your castle, you're responsible for. What happens in your castle is your responsibility. So if Pete, you were to put a sign out in front of your house tonight that says big party tonight, everybody welcome, no matter, you can do anything you want. And you kept the front door open and all kinds of people came in, and say around 2:00 in the morning, there's somebody in the corner shooting up heroin. There's somebody out in the kitchen selling child porn. There's somebody raping somebody in the back room. There's, they're in the other back room, they're organizing a hit squad to take out a politician.
Yeah.
And the police bust in. You go to jail. Because all those people go to jail too, but you go to jail because you opened the door, you let that happen in your house, you knew about it, and you did nothing to stop it. That literally goes back to the year 10,000, 1,000. I mean, that's literally 1,000-year-old doctrine.
Right.
And similarly for a business. If a business opens its door, a bar, a restaurant, a Home Depot, and says, come on in and do whatever the hell you want, and evil stuff happens, that business is responsible. Well, in their infinite wisdom in 1996, the U.S. Congress passed Section 203 of the Telecommunications Act of 96, which says, for the first time ever in history, you can build a building only on the internet, and you can invite people in, and they can commit all kinds of god-awful crimes. They can do human trafficking, they can be selling drugs, they can be organizing terrorist attacks, and you, as the owner of that house, have absolutely no responsibility and may not be held responsible for what happens. And thus, Mark Zuckerberg became one of the richest guys in the world.
And the owner of that house would be the internet service providers like Time Warner or...
talking about like Facebook or Twitter or,
networks, different platforms, YouTube, any of that. Right.
Social media. Yeah.
So what can be done? What should be done? What should the federal government do to try to rein in and regulate these? I think the way you say that they always have, I think still can, the phone companies. What's the difference?
Right. Well, under Title II of the Telecommunications Act that was passed back in the 1920s or 30s, I forget which, it's in the book. In order, if you're neighbor, if your phone company, if the police want to listen in on your phone conversation, they have to get a warrant that's signed by a judge. And it was that way for your internet communications as well, up until about 3 years ago. And in other words, the internet coming into your house, the company that brings it in could not spy on you. And, if the police wanted to access your internet feed and see what you're doing, they had to get a warrant. It was just very straightforward. So Donald Trump hires a lawyer out of Verizon, or a former Verizon lawyer, Ajit Pai, puts him in charge of the FCC. Yeah. Ajit Pai does a little song and dance where he takes 1 million phony bot messages and says, oh, look at this public approval for ending privacy on the internet.
Right.
And he destroyed what we referred to as net neutrality. I think it really should be called internet privacy. And so now your internet service provider can literally see everything you do, every single keystroke, every page you look at, whether you slow down for particular pictures when you're scrolling, whether you stop at particular ads, you don't even have to click on them. They know that you looked at it. All of this stuff, and they're recording this and packaging it, or have the ability to anyway, and sell it to anybody they want without your knowledge or permission. We are the only country in the developed world that allows our internet service providers to do that, and it's exclusively because of Ajit Pai and Donald Trump. And that's another thing that needs to be fixed. It's so ironic. If you're walking around with a cell phone and you call somebody and it's bouncing off the cell phone tower, so you're using the infrastructure of the phone company, nobody can listen in on that without a warrant. Police can't listen in. Even the phone company can't listen in on without a warrant because of Title II of the Telecommunications Act. On the other hand, if you send somebody a text message, right, or if you send somebody a message using an app, your internet service provider can record every single little bit of it.
And you're obviously arguing, I think it's hard to argue about, that there should be no distinction with those different forms of communication.
That's correct. I think that we should go back to applying Title II to internet communications, just like we do to telephone communications. Sadly, the Patriot Act folks, who want more and more government intrusion, want to do the exact opposite. They want to stop applying Title II to the phone calls and say even your phone calls are no longer secure.
I love the internet privacy language instead of net neutrality. I've always felt like we talked about that so much, and it's always confusing and boring to people. Before I let you go, I want to ask you one more question, just about your reaction to, or how you see this war playing out. How much have you been talking about it? Who have you been talking with? Isn't this what, as you've watched and seen these wars throughout the history of your life and your career, hasn't so much of it been about energy? And I just always remember Tom Ricks, the military historian and writer, saying on Meet the Press and just after 9/11, or maybe just before, that we'll continue to fight wars as long as we're getting energy, oil from other countries. It was like 30 years ago. Isn't that what this is about? And what are your thoughts on what you see playing out?
Well, oil is certainly fueling this war. Without the ability to sell their fossil fuels, Russia would be, right now their economy is half the size of California's. It would be a fifth the size of California's without that. But I think that I'm taking Vladimir Putin at his word. About 3 weeks ago, he did this hour-long rant on national television, a history lesson, in which he basically said, this is not about NATO. This is not about the West. This is about the fact that Ukraine was never actually a legitimate country. It's part of Russia. It used to be the capital of Russia. And we're simply taking back our territory, period, full stop. And by the way, it's been taken over by crazy drug-addled Nazis. And so we've got to liberate our own territory. So I'm taking him at his word for that's really what's motivating him. It is consistent with everything he's done and continues to do. I think, though, that he's like the dog that caught the car. I think that he had no idea that, and I think this is why he just fired the head of the FSB and his assistant, and he just fired 8 of his generals. It's because, he had surrounded himself with yes men who were telling him what he wanted to hear, and he wasn't getting the actual story. This is always the problem with autocracies. It's why democracies, generally survive better over the long run. And, I think this is the end of Putin politically. Whether it's the end of his life, who knows? Whether it's the end of his presidency, it might take a year or two for that to dissolve. But I think that, and we have to keep in mind also, Pete, and I think this is really important, that It took Americans 5 or 6 years to realize that we had been lied into Vietnam, a war where we killed over 2 million people, far more than Putin has killed in Ukraine. It took us the better part of 3 years to figure out that George W. Bush and Dick Cheney lied us into the war in Iraq. Again, a war where we killed more people than have died so far in Ukraine and destroyed far more infrastructure and buildings. But it took us years for the general pop. I mean, there were always some of us on the fringes, right, yelling no to the war in Vietnam. That was me in the 60s. No to the war in Iraq. I wrote a book about it in 2003 called We the People. This was just, overreach, and it was all about the natural resources, and Dick Cheney saying that Iraq had the second largest reserves of oil in the world. But it still took years for us to figure out. I don't think that, and our media is far more open than Russian media.
I was going to say, in all these examples, you had a much freer press, and certainly you could find great journalists, even all the way back to the 60s.
Exactly. So I don't think that the Russian people are going to wake up tomorrow morning and rise up against.
Well, what about you? That's a great point, but
inner circle might.
What about the economy? I feel like nobody is predicting what it seems could happen very quickly. Is that their economy is going to collapse? They can't even open their stock market. Their money is worth hardly anything, and everything that's fun has left, from Netflix to McDonald's. Like, what do you think your analysis of what's going to happen to their economy? Isn't it going to be very fast, and doesn't that mean a lot?
It's going to depend on how effective Putin's propaganda mechanism is within his own country. In 1930, I forget the year, it was in the early 1920s, late 19-teens, when the Treaty of Versailles was signed, that said that Germany had to pay back France and all the other countries for the damage they did in the war. John Maynard Keynes came out and said, this is going to bankrupt Germany. And there's no way that Germany can pay this back. And it's not just going to bankrupt them, it's going to set up World War II.
Right.
And he was absolutely right, because, what the Germans did was they devalued their currency. I mean, the reparations were denominated in Deutschmarks. So if you got to pay back 1 billion Deutschmarks, we'll make it so that 1 billion Deutschmarks will buy you a loaf of bread. And that's what they did. But that paved the way for Hitler. And because the Germans saw themselves as the victims of this Western embargo, or, whatever you want to call it, something very similar to what we're seeing right now, sanctions. And so if Putin can play this the way that the right did in Germany in the late 1920s and early 1930s, he may well come out. And by the way, Castro did the same thing in Cuba, and he may come out ahead. On the other hand, if enough can seep through the internet that, this war was wrong and that this has to do with the war saying, oh, my God, no. And especially, I think the pivot point here is going to be China.
Right.
Because so much of the consumer goods sold in Russia right now, just like here in the United States, are from China. If he loses China, he's really lost it all. If he hasn't, then, we might be back to John Maynard Keynes's prediction, only this time World War III.
Great talking to you, Tom. I really appreciate your time. Congratulations on this new book. And I'm going to annoy you to talk just randomly very soon about a bunch of other things that I just want to get your take on, things that you might not always talk about as much on the radio. I really appreciate it, Tom. Thank you so much, and congrats.
Thanks, Pete. It's great being with you. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Thom Hartmann, everybody. Yeah, there he goes. So great to catch up with him. That book is very interesting. I highly recommend the books from many of the books in that series. ThomHartmann.com. Listen to his radio show. Subscribe to his Substack. And let him know you heard him right here on Stand Up with Pete Dominick. That always means a lot. And hopefully he'll come back and just shoot the shit with me about several other things. And follow him on Twitter. Check him out at Thom. That's Thom. Thom. I know, it's insane. _Hartmann. And 2 N's. Also insane. Thom_Hartmann with 2 N's. All right, there you go. TheHartmannReport.com. Thom Hartmann. All right, well, that's all I've got for you on today's episode of Stand Up. It's late. It's time for me to turn in because tomorrow I'm going for a walk, a hike in the woods with my dog, Dr. Zatz, and his dog. Always one of my favorite things, and I haven't done it in like a month, so I can't wait for that. I hope you're doing something fun, being good to yourself, taking a moment to be grateful for all that you have, and I am for you. I love you. I appreciate you. John Carroll, take us out, brother.
That's right. We got to ride. for your fence, even if it ain't a very friendly audience. Well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense, and you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town, just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of a stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up. We got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up. You got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well, and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.